Hi all, so thank you so much for being here. I'm Rabbi Leah. I think I know most of you, but not everyone knows each other. And so what we're going to do in the next hour and 20 minutes is I will ask you just to check in and tell me a little bit about why you're here, which will genuinely help me understand what to focus my talk on. And then I have, a set of notes here where I'm going to give you a structured sort of sense of my connection to Israel-Palestine that ends with this last 9 months sabbatical and some reflections and some themes, and then going to open it up to questions. And so, as you can imagine, this is one of the third rails of the Jewish community. And I think rightly so, in the sense that we all have very different feelings and overlapping feelings and intense feelings about where 45% of the Jewish world lives these days and where we have ancestral and spiritual connections, but also it's so much in the political and public discourse, and there's all sorts of painful intersections for all of us around it, as well as positive ones. And so what I wanted to ask is that you give me the same respect you give each other, which is that I'm going to share. You do not have to agree with me. This is about me sharing and saying my particular story. And I want respect on that, which just means you can ask me any question you want about it, but there's going to be no yelling, no name calling, no demonizing people in this. And the same when you check in and say, what brought you here. We're going to all just be incredibly loving to one another and have very open minds, which I know we can do. I'm not worried about that at all, but I just wanted to say that at the start. And we're not going to resolve anything in this hour, so there's no reason also to come with the level of angst that would mean that you think we're going to do that. We're just going to listen to each other and get some thoughts. And I'm really glad to all be here. So without further ado, I think what would be lovely as a check-in, and I'll write this in the chat, is name if you wanted to share, pronouns if you wish, where you are, because I just think it's always fun on Zoom to place people in time and space, and then one sentence on what you're interested in general about Israel-Palestine, and one sentence more on specifically on what you'd want to hear me talk about or discuss with each other about my sabbatical of the past 9 months specifically. So I'm going to write that in the chat. One sentence on about my sabbatical specifically this past 9 months in Jerusalem. Okay. I'm going to put that there. Okay, I've written the check-in in the chat for people who are more visual. And then what I'm going to have you do is popcorn the next person, which is just like fun speak for it. Call on someone else whose name you can see. And they can always just pass. If you want to pass, you're allowed to pass, of course. So I'll say that again just for myself. I'm Leah. I use she, they pronouns. I'm in my study here in Queen's Park, where I've lived for the last 3.5 years. So half the time that I've worked at Kehillah. And what am I interested in general about Israel-Palestine? I think you're going to hear, so I don't think I have to share with you too much because that is the meat of our discussion and specifically my sabbatical. And I will popcorn to Tamara.
Okay, I'm Tamara, she, her. I live in Stoke Newington, Stamford Hill, but I'm in Barcelona this week for work. What am I interested in about Israel? Maybe I'll start, Leah, with the sentence about your sabbatical. I think I'm interested in just hearing about, I guess, particularly what the activism you did in the West Bank, whatever you're able to share about that. I guess my main interest is about in terms of Israel-Palestine is about peace, justice, finding, long-term solution for everyone who lives there to be able to live with as much equality and dignity as anyone can in the society we currently have. Maybe I'll say that. Claire.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire. I'm currently at home in Seven Sisters, North London. I am really interested in learning about what you learned and learning about how that might have changed your views and perspective. And I will pass it to Simon.
Hi, I'm Simon. Sorry, I'm looking a bit ghost-like. No idea why. Uh, Normally the video works. Um, I'm at home in South Hackney, uh, with a view overlooking the common, which is beautiful and not so green at the moment. And I guess I read a lot about Israel in the papers. Haaretz and sort of general media, and it's always good to hear from people who are actually there rather than from people who have to make a living out of attracting people to read their stuff. And so I think it would just be great to hear that. And I'm going to pass it to Bo.
Hi everyone, thank you for having this. Yeah, my name's Bo. I'm in Barnet in North London, and I have also been to Israel and Palestine this year. I got back in February. I was doing solidarity work there, and I'm also like in standing together. And I think one of your questions was what we want to get out of this. I mean, my whole thing is just, for everybody there to have peace, obviously, Israelis and Palestinians. And that's why I was there. And I wanted to sort of see both sides as well. And for me, it's just, crazy to consider one and not the other. So that's why I'm here. And I would love to hear how it was for you as well, about it.
Thanks, Bo. Oh, want to call in? Who hasn't gone? Raise your hand.
I forgot to Rochelle or Sylvia. I don't know who's not gone yet.
Let's do Rochelle and then Sylvia.
Hi, Rabbi Leah and everyone. I'm Rochelle. I'm in Walthamstow, and I saw the link quite late, and I just thought, oh, that looked really interesting. So I guess I'm here just to hear what it's like from a kind of like Simon, like an unfiltered kind of version of what life's been like, and how easy it was to live there.
Thank you, Rochelle. Sylvia. We'll pass to Sylvia just because Bo already kind of signposted it.
I was just straight off mute. I'm Sylvia, I'm in Stoke Newington. I've been active in support of Palestinian rights since about 2004 from a meeting of what was then called the Bereaved Families Forum. It just suddenly made me realize that I might be able to contribute something. And I made a few trips to the West Bank and ran children's art workshops there. Got a glimpse at the time, which of course doesn't compare at all to now. And I've been active ever since, but almost, yes, in fact, pretty exclusively in Jewish groups, in Berlin where I lived and here in London. I'm here this evening. First of all, I've been really looking forward to hearing your experiences, your thoughts, and how you developed over that period and what's changed, to get to know you better there. And coupled with the religious aspect of your stay, although the Jewish people in the groups I'm in are all Jewish, and some are from religious backgrounds and some are practicing, on the whole, that's not a focus. So I'm very, very interested in that combination. And I pass to Matan.
Hi everyone. So I my pronouns are he, him. I live in Kiryat Shmona in northern Israel, next to the border with Lebanon. I was the administrator of Kehillah 1 year ago. I'm very excited to be here. First time after a year or so that I'm being around Kehillahniks. And yeah, I just wanted to listen what you all have to say, and the experience of Rabbi Leah that I also kind of witnessed in some parts, and some parts not. And yeah, just paying respects to your views, voices. I think this was very important to me during the situation now. Yeah. And I will pass it to Saul. Saul and
Hi, I'm Saul. I'm in Tottenham Park with my wife Naomi, and we're I'm particularly interested in any ideas on how to talk about what's going on with family in Israel that go right across the political spectrum. And we're shortly going to eat, so we'll turn our camera off so you don't all have to watch us.
I wanted to reflect that whilst Israel-Palestine and the conflict is very much uppermost in many thoughts and feelings, I also recognise that, Leah, you went to Israel to study and to learn, that's really a privilege for us as a community in Kehillah to have you enrich your rabbinical knowledge. And I think for me, it's kind of, whilst I feel really torn because I really like to know more about both sides, both parts of that conversation, but I don't want for us to lose sight of the fact that it was a journey for you in terms of your rabbinical learning. So I'm really like to hear more about that.
Shall we pass it to Andrew?
Yeah, and we'll turn off our camera now.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm also here with Caroline. I'm also in Tufnell Park. It's Saul. It's odd we never bump into each other except at shul, but we don't. I've been to Israel many times, and I read Haaretz, which I recommend to anybody. But there's no spiritual or religious dimension in that. And I went to Israel in 1976 for the first time as a very committed Zionist, and I've now become a non-Zionist. And so I'm really interested to hear about a sort of a rabbinic view of what's going on from somebody who's also active. And Caroline?
I'm Caroline. I am involved with the Parents Circle as the chair of the UK Friends of the Parents Circle, which was formerly known as the Bereaved Families Forum. And Andrew and I are weighing up whether we want to go and take part this year and protect the harvest, because the Parents Circle is one of many organisations that is supporting that initiative. So we're weighing it up. Our Palestinian friends in Ramallah have told us not to.
Because it's not safe.
They said it's not safe. The briefing I went to, the online briefing, was giving a different message last week. So I'd be very interested to hearing your thoughts, Leah, and anybody else who's been involved in solidarity work.
Let's switch off as well. And I'm sorry, I've lost track.
Raise your hand if you've yet to check in.
Oh, Avi.
Yeah, I'm Avi. He, him, in North London, Jewel. I'm interested in similar to Andrew and Caroline, that I'm considering going to Israel-Palestine on a similar kind of trip. So I'm interested to hear what that's like, and if I should. And also interested to hear in the learning side of it, what was learned, how was that learning in Israel, Palestine. Yeah.
Thanks. So let's pass to Justin, and then I'll share what Holly said, and then we can see if we've missed anybody.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you for holding this meeting, this space. So I haven't been to Israel since, and for the only time I've been was on a school journey when I was 14, and I haven't either felt I wanted to or felt safe to go there again. And I'm interested to hear if in any way your perspectives have changed, and whether it's the term non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, that use what your definition of that is, what you mean by that, and then also just interested to hear what we don't hear in the mainstream news, and hopefully positive as well as things that are obviously very difficult, but positive news as well, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Justin. I'll read what Holly said as she's on the tube. She did a check-in. Holly, she, her, she's specifically on the Northern line, and she wants to hear how my experience has shifted my perspective. And then we had Natasha, I don't know if you can, from the park, and I think Simone, if either of you are available. And Sue.
Hello.
So Natasha, Simone, Sue.
Hello, this is Natasha zooming in from the park. I am interested in hearing about, I guess, like what you think in the like air and the water has like changed. I'm not sure how to phrase it any more specifically than that, you know, like do people seem more like suspicious of each other, or like tireder, or like have their like priorities changed? Like I don't know, like do you think that Netanyahu's going to win the next election, or do you think we'll go to jail? Yeah, and then also I would like to hear about your experience in the yeshiva. I say this as someone who's like never been to Israel. So like all of my experiences second hand. I guess this is anyway, that's me.
Thank you, Natasha. Simone, are you there to check in? It's okay if not. I know you and I can wave at you. Oh, that's Simon. I'm sorry. I thought you were Simone, who was another Kehillah adjacent person. Great. So we've heard from Simon. Makes sense because it's double yud, so it'd be a different sound. Thank you. Okay, Sue. That's good. Go from brother to sister.
Huh. Okay, sorry, I'm babysitting, so things were a little bit disrupted, but I was just hoping to catch up on some of the interesting things that you did. I didn't have any particular aims in mind from listening. I was just keen to hear, and I will hear some of it in between, making sure these two little girls don't fall off a tree.
Great. Thank you, Sue. I think we got everybody. Shout if not, otherwise I'll make a start. So as I said, for those who were filtering in, I wanted to check in and genuinely hear what people were interested in. I also named something about mutual respect, that we're not going to resolve any of our differences nor the situation in this next hour, I'm sorry to tell you. So we can all be calm and listen to one another and learn. And also, I will just add one further thing, which I didn't say at the beginning because I wanted to say it right before I did my talk, which is that we've come to a line at Kehillah, which is on the front page of our website for those that actually nerd out and bother to look at it, which says something like, we have many different views on Israel-Palestine, but we share the belief that everyone there, Palestinians and Israelis and everyone else, should live with dignity and equality. And I think that is a really good line to start with, because I think we all agree on that in this chat, and that is a starting point that I actually think should be obvious, and yet actually from different angles is not obvious. So we can reflect on that hopefully a bit as I walk through this. And then, yeah, hearing from you specifically about your interests, I do hope that over the course of this, you'll hear a bit about my activism and just activism in general, that we can talk a little bit about solidarity work. Is it safe? Is it effective? We've got Bo here also, who has done, I imagine, quite a bit. And then Avi and Andrew and Caroline and other folks thinking about it. That'll be part of the conversation. It will be unfiltered, as I think Rochelle put it. And how to talk with family in Israel-Palestine. I definitely want to meditate on that in this thing, though I don't have any answers. It's a great question, and Matan and others can speak about that more specifically than I. And then the identity labels, Zionist, anti-Zionist, I hope to speak a bit to that. And then the big picture zeitgeist vibes that Natasha was talking about, I do hope to also speak to that without doing hopefully any serious violence to the fact that if you're talking about vibes, I'm talking about Shabbos lunches I went to, so everyone can appreciate, where I'm getting my, it's a sample size of 9 months, not 26 years of being a reporter for Haaretz, right? But I will tell you some of those things, and hopefully, and finally, like learning what I learned and how it changed me. Do push me on that, because I am going to talk about that, but I would love to talk about that more in the Q&A, and specifically like what Torah I learned. I'm going to talk about two threads as I segue now into the structure, and the two threads are really, I think, reassuringly for what people are interested in. On one hand, Torah, and I would say more broadly that I would call that Jewish tradition. And then on the other hand, the other thread, human rights, and what I might call more specifically Palestinian solidarity. And those are two things that thankfully intertwine, but are also the two things I think I've found myself over the last 20 years going back to Israel-Palestine to seek. So that's why I went again this past 9 months. But what I really wanted to start with is sort of a story that I've told some of you over coffee, and not everybody here, the whole, which is like the community organizing 101 story, one-to-one story they tell you, where they say, tell the whole story. You can never tell the whole story, but I kind of wanted, in preparing this, I thought I'm going to zoom in on my 9 months at the end of this, but in this next hour, I'll take hopefully, half of it or whatever to tell you how I got to the 9 months, and then what the 9 months meant, and then we'll open it for questions. And that actually starts, I realize, all the way back with Jewish summer camp. So we'll start from the beginning. I grew up as a little Reformed Jewish kid in Kansas City. If you put your finger literally in the middle of the map of the United States, and it's as far south as it is north, as far east as it is west, exactly in the middle, that's where I grew up. And every summer I went with my cousins from age 8 until from age 7 till age 12 to a camp called Camp Sabra, if you can believe. And for those that know, Sabra is a word that comes from like the Zionist myth, which is that like we're going to make ourselves anew in the land, like the Sabra, which is a hard plant on the outside and soft and juicy and sweet on the inside. And that's the idea of what a sort of native-born Jewish Israeli is supposed to be like. And the reason my camp was called that is because originally it was a Zionist pioneer camp. And when it was that iteration of itself, of course, it was called Camp Hawthorne, because you didn't want to be like known around by the Goyim by like what you were doing in the 50s and 60s in the middle America. So you were called Camp Hawthorne to look, waspy like all the other camps. But actually what they were doing is they were putting people through like boot camp and teaching them how to light a fire and take a gun apart and farm and ride a horse and all that stuff. And then they sent people to make Aliyah to the newborn state of Israel. And this sort of gung-ho mentality, even in the Middle West of my youth, had subsided. And by the time I went, it was like a totally, bougie would be pushing it because it was kind of rough, but like middle class camp for kids to go for the summer and learn a little Jewish. And that's what it seemed to me mostly. But on reflection, there was a lot of the DNA of that, which makes sense of its founding ethos. What that meant is that every morning we sang Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, which like at first was complete gibberish to all of us, but by the end of 2 to 4 weeks, which is how long you go to American Jewish summer camp, like we knew by heart. And we would raise the Israeli flag along with the American flag. Those were like our two civil religions. And then everything at the camp was named after a place in Medinat or Eretz Israel, in the state or the land of Israel. So like when you were like 7 and you were a boy, you were in Golan. And if you were a girl, you were in Sharon. Then you were in Almagor, Habonim. Like people who've had this experience can like imagine it. And for those that can, it's like one of the classic like establishmentarian Jewish middle class experiences of the 80s and 90s. And I had that experience. And the idea was supposed to be at the end that you go to Israel for a big trip. And the ideal would be that you moved there and were part of the project. And what I think is really interesting is years later, my sister and I, who both walked together as comrades to our kind of adult understanding of what this meant as a moral and spiritual inheritance, she would end up working for 6 years for the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which is one of the main organizations that runs the Solidarity Olive Harvest from the diaspora Jewish part of the pie, right? Because there's also a lot of non-Jewish internationals and a lot of Israeli Jews and a lot of Palestinians, but from the diaspora Jewish, our side of the pie, Center for Jewish Nonviolence is one of the most respected and involved organizations. And she and her fellow staff members would be, you know, deep in the occupied West Bank on their literally years of living on the ground, doing solidarity in Palestinian communities, sometimes living there for months at a time. And she would be in a bunk bed at night, getting ready for the IDF to come in and rouse them all out of their beds and put M16s in their faces and scream at them. And she would say, I did what Sabra told me to do. I came to do this work. But it was such a, I think, a different imagining than what Sabra had imagined. And yet also, I really do think she took it very seriously. So I guess that's the sort of intersection of things I want to talk about, which is that before all of that, and before I had any clarity about any of that or knew any of that, I was at Sabra, and then I had a usual sort of middle-class Jewish life in America and went to university, and then I'd always known that I wanted to be a rabbi since I was 12 years old, and so that meant I knew I had to go and learn like Torah, I needed to learn some Hebrew, and if you grow up as a non-Orthodox kid, I think the unfortunate thing is it means you do that all very, very late when your brain doesn't work as well because you've learned all this other great stuff, which is great. Like I did an English degree and I loved it, but I barely knew how to read a Mishnah, which is something that you learn much younger in more traditional parts of the world, until I went after university to Jerusalem. And I was sent, as most rabbinical schools still do, they send you for usually a year of your 4 to 6 years of seminary, of post BA study, because basically outside of the Haredi world, most programs across the whole Jewish world, whether that's the Americas or South Africa or Eastern Europe or wherever, they send you to a BA and then 4 to 6 years of rabbinical school. And usually one of those years or several summers or a couple semesters are in Jerusalem. The thinking being, I think, separate of any of the politics of it, that you're going to learn a lot there because there are so many great Torah teachers. And I did have that experience. So I went after college to do what would kind of be the equivalent of like a gap year if you were to do it before college. I lived in Jerusalem for 11 months with a Jewish Israeli roommate from a kibbutz down south. And that was like my personal choice of pushing the boat out. A lot of people lived with fellow like Americans, and I was trying to like to learn more and to like get involved. And so I had to go on like the Israeli version of Craigslist, but I don't even know what they would call that in Britain. Yad Shtayim. I don't know what. Did you have Craigslist in 2008 here in the UK? Anyway, I went on the Israeli version of it, and I found this roommate. And lived there for 11 months and was like in intensive Hebrew classes, and also was learning from some really great Torah teachers who also taught at the Orthodox institutions and the Masorti ones. There's this whole sort of like revolving door of like people who know a ton of Torah, and that's why they're in Jerusalem. And I started learning with them. I learned like the book of Jeremiah from one of the great scholars of Jeremiah. And he would always like walk around Jerusalem, and you could tell he was actually seeing Jeremiah walking around Jerusalem instead of modern Jerusalem. And there was something very moving about that whole experience. And at the same time, because I considered myself like a sort of social progressive, but had like completely ignorant non-knowledge of anything going on with the Matzav, with the situation of Israelis and Palestinians, I knew I needed to like learn more. And I followed Rabbi Arik Osherman, who many people here know, to the West Bank for the olive harvest. In retrospect, it was the olive harvest, though at the time that meant nothing to me, which is around the time of Sukkot, not coincidentally, actually completely overlapping sort of cultural traditions. If you learn with Tal Jenner Klausner, the sort of Kehillah adjacent teacher who still lives in the land, they'll tell you that like if you go deep into the olive harvest tradition and you learn about the Arabic words for that time of year and the words in Sukkot and the harvest, there's a lot of overlapping knowledge and lingo and stuff. And so I went to the olive harvest with the Rabbi Arik Osherman, I had no idea where I was. It turns out I was like right outside of Jerusalem when they were building the separation barrier. And what I remembered seeing with my own eyes, and which really started to make sense clear to me, was that all I could understand is that the powers that be, the municipality or whoever, the state, as it turns out, had made a huge cement wall through acres of land that were owned by these working class farmers, not so dissimilar from my dad's people, my dad grew up on a farm, 5 generation farmers in Kansas, in rural Kansas, and they just made a giant wall through their field, and they weren't able to get from one side to the other or access like half their land. And that was just like clear from going, it was like, and our job, because we were internationals and we all had other citizenships or Israeli citizenship, and none of these folks did, which I didn't understand at the time either. We were able to cross the barrier, and our job was they would instruct us the best they could, we ignorant non-farmers, what we needed us to do, whether it was to water something or to plant more or to prune or to gather the olives. And I think we did a terrible job, of course, as you would do as complete ignoramuses, but I also felt, and that way that I've always felt in solidarity work, that there was something like genuinely important because they'd invited us there and they were able to give us instructions in a world in which it was clear that everyone else was giving them instructions and tell us what to do, and that we had done some small something just by the way that they said that they were happy for us to be there and thanked us. And that was like my experience of the occupation, but I had no real understanding of it in a larger capacity. And in some ways, I think what I continued to do, that was 2008, and between 2008 and 2014, so we're talking like 6-7 years, I pulled on the thread of that connection between like, okay, there's Torah here, like Rabbi Arik Osherman was doing that for Rabbis for Human Rights because he believed in Torah, and it was also happening because the Israeli state was trying to say that that was Torah. And I kept pulling on that thread and pulling on that thread, and I kept going back because I had had such a great time with these Torah teachers. So I went back 2 summers after that in 2010 and in 2014, and I went to a place called the Conservative Yeshiva, which I'd recommend to any of you. It's a really lovely place with a lot of diversity of opinion on this specific issue and a lot of activists, and it's the Masorti movement's world yeshiva headquarters in Jerusalem, which makes it sound much grander than it is. It's about 25 rough and ready students and 10 faculty like learning full-time in Jerusalem, Talmud and Torah and Tanakh and Halacha. And I went and I learned there for 2 summers. And the second time I went, 2014, it was one of the Gaza wars. And I remember having to run to the shelter during the Gaza war, the way that everybody had to do. And then meanwhile, hearing all of my Jewish Israeli acquaintances talk about how everyone was being called up to go into Gaza and about how they were just raining hell, and there was like a sort of pride in it down like upon like Gaza. And it's that moment you have that you only have because you're an outsider, because like, listen, I grew up in the US, I have no stones to throw about going in to places and raining misery down on people and thinking you're doing a great thing. It's just harder to see it when it's your own national context, and easier to see it when it's not. But the way they were talking, it like another sort of shoe drop for me that was like similar to the shoe of going with Rabbis for Human Rights to see the wall, which was like, these people we're talking about are not human anymore to the people that I'm speaking with about them. Like, and I don't think I could have articulated it as such then, but I remember Rabbi Joel Levy, who is actually Rabbi Josh Levy's brother. So Josh Levy, who's one of the co-leads of our movement in Jerusalem, he has a brother who's the head of Conservative Yeshiva, that place I was studying those 2 summers. And Rabbi Joel, bless him, gave a wonderful drash at one Shabbat where he said, I know we feel endangered because they're throwing rockets at us, but the difference in power discrepancy between them and us is like a fence, where we're their children on one side throwing over rocks, and we're throwing back like more deadly deadly weaponry. And he was like, so I want you all to stop talking this way. And it was basically a togacha, a moral rebuke of the community. And I remember being really struck by that because I'd been learning with Rabbi Joel the whole summer. And I felt that he had kind of articulated some of what I'd been feeling. And I made a commitment to myself after that I was, if I ever came back to learn more Torah, that I had to learn more about that. And that I had to do something, not just learn, but like actually stand with people who were being affected by that. So inevitably, because I was obsessed with the whole thing, I came back the following summer, 2015, and studied at Pardes, where I then studied this past summer, which is a very similar yeshiva to the conservative yeshiva. The difference is that it's pluralist, meaning it's completely cross-communal Jewishly, whereas conservative yeshiva is the Masorti movement's yeshiva. But in essence, that makes them very similar. They're both English-speaking, both all genders, both any age, any Jewish background, or people converting or who were just interested. And I went to that place in 2015, and I knew that I had to put my money where my mouth was. So I made this commitment. And I went and I followed a woman that I knew very vaguely from New York, because I liked that she liked Torah, but that she also was interested in this solidarity work, which I didn't even know was called solidarity work at the time. And she was co-leading a Shabbat in solidarity with Susia, which many of you know, but some of you don't, is in the occupied West Bank, in Masa Friata, in the southern part of the West Bank, in the South Hebron Hills. It's about a 2-hour drive from Jerusalem, right south. And I followed them with Benji, with my partner there. We were married, and we went down there. And in fact, for those of you who like Jewish geography, we were currently living at that time with Anna Wolfson, née Posner, in Jerusalem. And she was asking us with interest about, what we were doing, and was really supportive of it. And meanwhile was helping to run Netzer, the, worldwide progressive Jewish youth movement from Jerusalem. So we went down to Susia, and it was my first time spending the night in the military occupation, which it really felt like that. We were there in this community, which thankfully is still there, but very beleaguered, that has never been given permission to build or to really legally exist, even though they existed well before the occupation. And that's kind of the systems that I started to understand. So when you go out to the West Bank, one of the first things they explain to you is there's area A, B, and C, which we inherited from the Oslo Accords. And once you kind of start to understand them, what you start to understand is, with the breakdown of the Oslo Accords, or by design, some people who are more cynical, and I'm of two minds about it, will say what is left is that basically the Israeli state has full control over 60% of the West Bank. And in that 60%, including in Susia, if you are a Palestinian, you are a non-citizen who 95% chance, and this is like on the books from multiple human rights, research organizations that are Israeli as well as Palestinian, you will not be able to get a permit to get a car, or to build a house, or to expand your house. So you basically have no way to live. The hope being, and this has happened over the last 2 or 3 decades, that all of those folks who live in that 60% and are non-citizens will move into the percent that is in part controlled by the Palestinian Authority by agreement of Oslo in the 90s. And so that's what was happening. There's this huge mass ethnic cleansing that's going on, where most of it is sort of because life becomes so difficult. And that's what most solidarity work is about. The Olive Harvest, when you hear that talked about, is about people like us and other internationals who have citizenship and papers. And so it's harder to harass us and tell us that we can't be there, to come and help and stand with the people who just want to live there, either build their house, literally build their house, plant a vineyard, run their farm animals, send their kids to school. It's to make those things possible by accompanying them in those things, because they get stopped by the military, and they got stopped even more by the extremist Jewish settlers, who have a very intentional campaign of trying to take all of that land for themselves, and are succeeding in that at a very rapid pace in the last 2 or 3 years, especially under this most far right of Israeli governments. So that's what I ended up doing from 2015 until now. Whenever I go, part of what I do is replug in with the people I have met and cultivated like very deep relationships with in Maaseh Yatta, the Palestinian leadership of the various villages, who are the people who invite and decide what are the campaigns going to be and what do they especially need. So for example, over many years, I was involved in a direct action of rebuilding a well that the community had taken away, and rebuilding a road, and taking back a whole town that had been taken by military diktat because they called it a firing range but never used it, and these kind of things. And the most moving one was that one of retaking a town, because that was actually a huge, huge thing. And it's like, how do you even imagine how you do that? That was 2017. It was called the Sumud Freedom Camp, and it was inspired by Standing Rock and the Palestinian leadership of the South Hebron Hills, people you've seen on like documentaries if you watch No Other Land, like Bassel Adara and Auda Hathalin, who was murdered a year ago and was a friend of so many of ours because he was just a person who was such a great community organizer. He was literally able to connect with anyone who came and keep in touch with them. And other folks invited us, and they said, you know, there's this community that was depopulated in the 90s and early 2000s that they're doing nothing with, of course. They've just taken the land to have it be farmland, connected to one of the Jewish settlements. And what we want to do is, in cover of night, come back with enough international activists that they can't get the frick rid of us and rebuild the town. And it was an incredibly moving campaign because it was so chutzpahdik. It was so enormously bold. And what we did is we spent the night before, all of us, like hundreds of activists, and you imagine like to organize this on the roof of Bassel Adara's family's house in Tawani, like sleeping on sleeping bags. And then in the morning, Bassel's dad, who knew the land like the back of his hand because he'd grown up there and has been an activist in this cause since he was like a teen, in nonviolent resistance, he led us. And when I say we, it was like 300 people from Center for Jewish Nonviolence and Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now and Namod from Britain and other people who just wanted to be involved. And he walked us to the depopulated village. And by the time the sun came up, there were 350 of us there, and they couldn't get rid of us because it was going to be such an international incident. And it was amazing because we took back that land and we kept that land, as far as I know, in the hands of local Palestinians until very recently. And it got smaller and smaller because the problem was, and this is an interesting question about solidarity work and whether it's effective and how effective one can be, is all of us, most of us weren't locals or resident, and we couldn't stay there forever. And so as we left, other people from Hebron came down and people who were more local. And so there was like a sense of real like resistance that remained, but it was hard to keep the land indefinitely. And like what they do is they don't want it to be an international incident. So usually, thankfully, in the past, they wouldn't use live fire or shoot you. What they would do is they would arrest the leadership at night and take them to jail and try to intimidate them. And they would take away our generator so that we couldn't film what was happening. It was those kind of classic tactics, and that's still what they do. You know, like they make it so that you can't document. If you can't document, then you can't report. And that's one of and that's why I do find solidarity work also so moving and effective when it is because what they ask mostly the leadership there for you to do is to document it and to report it. Because sometimes that does have an effect, and I've seen it have an effect. It's why we were able to keep that land for so long, because they didn't want the Guardian or the BBC reporting that 350 people had been brutalized by the IDF, right? And it was also very difficult because, like, the other side of it is, I think many of us know people who have been enlisted into the army and had to do that stuff. And most of the kids who came in the dead of the night to take the generator were 18-year-old kids who had no idea what they were doing and were told by their officer, who was only like 24 or 25, that they needed to do this. And you could tell they had no sort of context of their own from our side about how we weren't just a bunch of absolute wankers just causing trouble for no reason, you know? Like that was the understandable, like, it's like this is another day on the job, and who the hell are these people? There was no context of like Susia or Nasser Nawaja's land or any of those things, because I didn't have those contexts. I had to go and make sure I got educated in it, and they are Dafka very specifically kept from being educated in that. So there is this whole level of sort of very depressing sort of mass misunderstanding that you can kind of see sitting partly in the middle. In any case, I kept on doing that, and I kept on going back with Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and I'm now on their advisory committee. That's one of the things I do outside of my work at Kehillah, is my small little bit of kind of trying to keep them doing things that are meaningful when they ask us our advice about, you know, our little angle in the diaspora and what I think from my London rabbi position would be useful, which I hope is somewhat useful when we have these meetings. And then I went right before coming to Kehillah, and I lived in East Jerusalem for 2 years. And that was a big change for me, because it was my most in-depth learning in yeshiva. Like I really got to a new place in understanding the Jewish tradition and in Talmud on the one hand, and I also learned a lot of Arabic and lived in a Palestinian neighborhood for over a year and a half. And that was hugely pushing the boat out for me, because it's very uncommon in East Jerusalem to meet internationals who are Jewish, though you do. And like the city is very much divided into living in West Jerusalem and being Jewish, and living in East Jerusalem and being Palestinian. So it was like I was boundary crossing all the time, and that was like really eye-opening as an experience for me, trying to figure out when to talk to someone in Arabic, when to talk to someone in Hebrew, when it was okay to say that I was Jewish, when it might be a little bit politically fraught to be a Jew in East Jerusalem, when almost every Jew who's visible in East Jerusalem is trying to have a sort of Jewish settlement within Palestinian neighborhoods. So the understanding is, if you're Jewish there, you probably are a zealot. So like it was a very interesting kind of time in my life, and I came to Kehillah right off the back of that and felt very welcomed by all of you, and having had these experiences, because I got feedback that my involvement in non-mode in the UK was part of some people's kind of interest in talking to me about coming to Kehillah, and that felt very important, that I could like bring all of my bits of myself. And then I remember I was sitting here in this very room in like the equivalent of that armchair behind me. It's a rocking chair now, but it was an armchair for some reason at that point. Who can remember why, in the middle of maternity leave and breastfeeding? But it was an armchair, and I was sitting there in October 2023 with like a 6-month-old Jules on Saturday morning of Simchat Torah, very, very tired, because she'd like been up. She wasn't a bad sleeper by any means for a kid that age, but she'd been up, 4 or 5 times a night, and sleep is precious to me. And I was sitting here in this study, and my sister, who had spent the last 6 years living in East Jerusalem, as I said, working for CJNV, and had just moved to London to be auntie to Jules, comes in. She'd been reading Haaretz, and she was like, something really bad has happened. It's actually really bad, and it's unprecedented, and you're gonna hear about it that way. Like and she was able to kind of contextualize it for me in a second. And what I later understood was, that hundreds of people had broken through the Gaza barrier into the Western Negev, Jewish Israeli kibbutzim, and like carried people off and murdered them, and driven their cars through, and like gone into a music festival and killed like all of these people that like I have friends who know those people. Like I have a friend, Marka, who I co-founded Non-Mode with, who like had 3 good friends who were at the Nova Festival who were killed that day. And I remember that happening, and I remember thinking, this is the most terrific thing, because like this is how like your politics should never be virtue signaling, because we live in a wider world, and all of these people are progressives, and they were murdered for living in their house. And it could happen to Jules, and God forbid this is going to be the excuse that this government needs to go and to literally just mow down the entirety of 2 million people in Gaza. And I remember having that clarity, not because I'm like a brilliant prophet, but because of all these other experiences, right? It was just like, okay, so that's where we're at. And I remember thinking, like, what is Kehillah gonna do and feel, and how am I gonna be able to talk to people about this? And I feel that that is indeed what happened, is that, like, there should have been a response to anything like that. I think that's just like people need to respond when hundreds of children and grandparents are murdered, and you need to make it clear that that can't happen in the world. And everything beyond that was like a terrible, both strategic mistake and also like a moral shame, like the level of devastation that has been wrought on Gaza, like the whole society destroyed. And I remember thinking, like, okay, well, so like I don't know how to engage with that. And when I had my sabbatical time, Benji, my partner, was like, we got to go learn more Torah. And I was like, you're right, we do. Like, this is what we need to do in the world. Like, this is how we understand how we like serve people and teach them, from the Torah that I learn. And I need to keep doing that. And so we looked at New York first, understandably. And we were like, we're going to go to the Upper West Side, back to this yeshiva that we also learned at for a year. And we'll have like a really nice time. And then we had the classic thing that any American here would laugh at me to say, which is like, you can't afford it because you have to pay $2,000 in healthcare a month just to live there. And that's not in your rent. That's not like in your utility bills. That's just $2,000 extra dollars. And we were like, okay, we actually don't have that, to go on sabbatical to New York. And I really struggled because there was a part of me that felt like what seemed the morally correct thing was like to close the door on being in a place that had destroyed an entire other society. And it's like it's a sliding scale, because it's like you could argue that the United States of America has done that at various points, and the question is when, and when does it become too much to say like one is complicit by being there. So I had all of these thoughts in my head, and then I like talked to a lot of good friends, mostly like in the lefty Jewish world, and really struggled with it and came to the conclusion that like, my calling is to learn Torah and to know about these things that I'm telling you about and to be involved in them. And that might make it difficult in this moment of discourse where everything's a binary, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm gonna go. And I'm really glad that I did, is the thing, because it didn't change anything about my political analysis. It just reminded me that closing doors is like sort of easy, first of all, and that making red lines is important if it's strategic. And maybe if it were strategic for me and I could have had more effect by making a red line, I would still be persuaded to do that. But what it felt like I needed to do was like go and learn and be there and learn more Arabic and learn more Torah and come back and talk to you all about this and struggle with it together. And Natasha asked about vibes. I mean, this is something that Matan and Bo and other people who've been there on the ground longer than me can tell you, is like, yeah, it's like very bad vibes. People are in a very bad way. They're incredibly traumatized, understandably, by all of the different things I've described over, like, I mean, Holly has a sister there, and we always talk about that because I had a sister there, you know, until recently. And it's like, you just go through round and round of like war and mistrust and killing, and you become more closed people, as any of us would become on every side. And there is something that I do feel like fundamentally got really, really bad, because of October 7th and then the Gaza war, which is that I think like the average Jewish Israeli cannot imagine a future living in the land with Palestinians because of the sense that there's no way to humanly interact. And it's wrong, of course, but it's also like what I ran into over and over again. Like I would be at Shabbos tables with very sweet like people who, one said to me offhandedly, I used to learn Arabic 5 years ago because I wanted to understand the Arabic music I love better. And he's like, and now I'll only learn it because I want to be safe. And it came from a place of total trauma, but it's also like incredibly racist, right? And I don't say that to like throw stones again, because it's very easy to see someone else's racism in their context than it is to see your own, of which we are absolutely culpable. But that was what I kept running into all the time. And at the same time, I ran into more people than ever who were putting their shoulder to the wheel and organizing, because it is also a moment that's woken up a lot of people. It's this like sort of weird paradox where on the one hand, everyone's in despair, both Palestinian and Israeli, than they've ever been. And yet there's also more exciting things happening. Like Haaretz just wrote a headline that said, October 7th woke up the left. And I think that's true, like in this weird way. Like I think there's also this really exciting thing happening with standing together and with a lot of Palestinian citizens standing on various left-wing tickets outside even of the Palestinian parties, and also the sense that maybe this election will be different. I mean, it depends. There's half the people are apocalyptic, as I just listened to on a Haaretz podcast, saying like, you know, it'll never not be Bibi. It's always been Bibi. He's a fox and he'll come back. And I think 100% that could happen. And then there's another half of people who are saying the polls are going our way. Like the coalition numbers keep falling, and the opposition numbers keep rising, and like they're probably undercounting people who are going to vote against Bibi because they're low information voters, which is a terrible word. But when they get to the polls, they're going to say anything but this, because that's how everyone kind of feels inside themselves. Not because we're all like ennobled, wise, non-racist geniuses, but because anything but this, right? Like, so I always have hope that like something will change. And it's like, you know, you talk to people about the Good Friday Agreement. You know, if you listen to people from A Land for All, which is this wonderful like confederationalist idea of a sort of one state minus or a two state plus, what they'll talk about is that right before Good Friday and right before apartheid fell and right before the Berlin Wall fell, no one believed any of those things was going to happen. And then they did. And I always do have hope that what we're trying to do with our bit of solidarity work, or our bit of putting our shoulder to the wheel here in London, is make it possible for when it happens, like to create the right ecosphere, just the right constellation of things, so that when it happens, there's like somebody that can imagine something after, right? And whether it's the confederationalist model or it's like all the local coexistence projects, which everyone on the hard left poo-poos because they're not about resistance, they're about coexistence. We're going to need a bunch of Israeli and Palestinian soccer clubs in the world to come, you know? Like we're going to need all this stuff. Like we're going to need it from all sides. And I do believe that we'll get there. Like I just saw Yehuda Shaul, who co-founded Breaking the Silence, one of these many human rights organizations, and he was asked by a bunch of my sort of more conservative rabbi colleagues here in London, like, don't you worry about going around and like sharing our dirty laundry with the Goyim? And he was like, no, what would make us the most safe is if we ended the occupation tomorrow. And he's right. Like, there would still be people who are anti-Semites, because it turns out there just are those people. But we can't worry about them. You know, we just have to do the thing that would actually be just, and that, thank God, actually would make a huge difference also for us. Because I really do believe that it would. I really do believe that that would make a huge difference also for the discourse that we're dealing with. And that's, I guess I wanted to touch on that last, is sort of like coming back here is hard, because as you all know, like the discourse is very binary. Like Kehillah, in some ways, Holly and I have talked a lot, sits between everything, because on one hand you have the establishment Jewish right, I think it's fair to call them, but they're perceived as the sort of center, like the board of deputies and parts of the United Synagogue, and they would say like they don't know how to say the word Palestine, or some of them are learning, but you know, very overly slowly. And then you have like parts of the sort of multiracial London hard left, of which a lot of us also have a foot in, and they don't know how to say Jewish Israeli without thinking that's a villain. And I don't like to do both sides of them, because there's a power dynamic and all the caveats apply, and yet I think we sit sort of in the middle of that situation, and that's like a very painful place to be as well. And I think, you know, like a couple of you said, like, what is the learning that I have learned? And I think when it comes to Israel-Palestine, it's something like we are here to like hold all of that as like progressive Jews in the diaspora, most of us progressive Jews in the diaspora, or in Israel-Palestine, or wherever we are, is like to hold the fact that like everyone should and is going to remain there, and it has to be, as Tamara said, like as just and as flourishing as it can be in the world that we live in. And I think that's an important thing for Kehillah to remind our brethren in more establishment Judaism. And I think it's an important thing for us to remind our mostly non-Jewish brethren in the Green Party and in parts of London that I really mostly love, that are, you know, trying to be anti-racist but have their moments of ignorance, and we're there to try to remind them of that as well. So I think that is my whirlwind tour. There are like a couple things I skipped over that I might bring up when you guys ask me questions about, you know, like I have a couple strained friendships that came from this experience, from deciding to go back. I can talk to you a bit more about the yeshiva, which I didn't talk to you about as much as I would like, and about how the Torah learning was involved in that. I guess I'll share maybe those two stories, like the stories of the relationships that were strained and the stories of the relationship of the yeshiva that sort of came from the other angle that were also strained. And then I'll open it for questions. So I had 2 or 3 people who have really struggled with me going back and learning Israel-Palestine. One is a Palestinian acquaintance here in London, who I like have a lot of time for, having struggled with that, like having his activism is around getting people out of Gaza who are still being like bombed every day, even with the like sort of named ceasefire. And I heard from his partner that he didn't want to talk to me and Benji when he saw us last time at a shared friend's wedding, and then he's just too nice and he talked to us. So that's a good example of, you know, how this stuff plays out in your actual life. And then I had a Jewish lefty friend in Brooklyn who said, like, it's a bridge too far. There was a genocide. You can call it a destruction of a community, whatever you want to call it. And we're not going to speak anymore. And that was very painful. And then I had one of my 2 most continuous teachers over these 9 months, who I learned with for days and hours, because that's how yeshiva is. You're there, you know, for like 12 hours sometimes if you're not a parent. And I learned with him all the time. And I knew he was living in a very modern Orthodox, like sort of national religious context at a kibbutz that's Orthodox up in the north, and he would come down and teach us a few times a week in Jerusalem. And yet he was also very sweet and very open and wanted to teach at a pluralist yeshiva to women, because that was like a human rights conviction of his. He and I like took 9 months to finally be able to have this conversation, and it was at our last Shabbat, and we like had a version of this conversation that we've just had. And he said to me, you know, I have many students whom I have loved and respect, who basically say like what we've done in Gaza is immoral, and what I see is that we needed to go and do this. And I said, so, and he goes, and they make me very uncomfortable, and I assume that they must be like mean or bad or crazy, but I know they can't be. And I said, so like, where does that leave you? Like, why haven't you cut off the relationships with these people? And he paused, and I felt, to his credit, said, because I'm not sure. And I felt, sometimes I tell that story and I feel like that's not enough, and like sometimes I tell it right now and it really hits me. I'm like, that's, and for me that was the power of community and of Torah, because we had studied for 9 months together, and that's what he had done with all these other students who were challenging him, and that kept him in a place that that man would no otherwise be, right? He is learning nothing, none of his narratives or his news feeds or the Torah he's learning is destabilizing him, but he had these experiences with all these students, and he is living in a place of uncertainty because of that. And I felt that that gave me some like window for hope, intra-Jewishly. Okay, here endeth my my spiel. Let's take these 20 minutes for thoughts and questions.
You said you were going to say something about the yeshiva. I would be really interested to know what you were doing for those 12 hours a day, having never been to a yeshiva.
Yes, so this is something I did mean to share in my, like, you know, long spiel, but didn't actually say. If you've never been to a yeshiva before, every yeshiva, including the one that Avi and I were on at Azara that I helped run this past week right outside of London. So like it can be as close as London if this happens, is you learn Talmud in the morning for 3 to 4 hours. So like you get up, you usually have breakfast with your yeshiva mates because you're already at school. And either because you live there or because like us adults, you get into school and then I say school as an American, obviously, and there would be cereal, and some people would have davened, they would have gone to the minyan, but like many people would like have slept in or not made it or be told off by their friends for not having made it or like never go. And then you would have 3 to 4 hours of Talmud with an expert teacher in the Talmud at the level of your experience. So what's pretty cool is you could be like totally beginning and you'd still be doing that, and you'd mostly be doing Mishnah, which is the supposedly easier bit because it's all in English, in Hebrew, whereas the Talmud is also in a cousin language, Aramaic, but actually Mishnah is hard too, but you would be starting with Mishnah if you were more beginner, and then doing like 3 to 4 hours of Talmud, which would look like what we do in our small bits in Kehillah. You would do Chavruta with a study partner for maybe 1 or 2 of those hours, and you would do Shiur, which is being in like a small seminar with the expert teacher for another hour and a half. And they would make sense of it for you, because often you would have just struggled to understand the words, but you would have like got a couple sentences that made sense and maybe thought you solved something, and then you would come to the class with the teacher, and if they're a great teacher, and thank God I've been blessed with many of them, they would like really push you so that you could explain it yourself, and then they would explain it to you, and you'd come out of that morning feeling like you'd understood something of the sugya, of the passage. And that could be on anything. So what we were learning the whole year was a really, really fun Masechet, a really fun volume of the Talmud, which is about marriage and divorce. And that could either, you could think that's very dry, but actually it's all stories about people who fell in love and then they had sex outside of marriage because they didn't wait till the wedding night, and what's going to happen to, their situation, or they really hate each other and they have to separate, and what does that look like in an agrarian society where like, does it mean that the woman is going to be chucked out of the house? No, because the Talmud is about ethical commitment. So it would be like, do you have to take care of the woman? Do the stepkid have to take care of the woman because she's not going to be able to get a job? And it was all these discussions that actually came to be about human beings. And then you have lunch, and then you usually have a bunch of afternoon classes. And if you're 18, the way many men do it, then you go into the night. But I ended at like a reasonable 5:30, and then there were evening classes you could take, but those are usually on like other subjects of Jewish interest, so like Hebrew Bible, Hasidus, like mystical sort of magical Judaism, like halakha, like how do you live Jewishly, what do the texts say about that, what do the great commentators and halakhic decisors say about that, learning how to chant the Torah, learning how to lead tefillah, to lead prayers, the way we do at Kehillah, learning about the prayers themselves, like what is the Amidah and the Shema, and like at a deeper level, what have other commentators said about them, these kind of things. And so you like get a really broad, in-depth, like Jewish knowledge education. And all of it is meant to be in the original, which means if you don't know any Hebrew, you start with the alphabet, and now these yeshivas that are really good at taking on us beginners, they'll get you to a place where you'll be shocked. You'll be able to, parse a sentence within 2 to 3 months. And then by the end of the 9 months, you're like reading, paragraphs because you spend so much time in it. Yeah, Saul and Naomi.
You might have this there. Well, first of all, before I ask my question, it's really amazing hearing your journey. So thank you for sharing that. You might have said this, but I imagine that if I was sitting there doing that kind of intensive study, as you said, it's all about human beings, it's about relationships, that you must also have been holding all of this other stuff simultaneously. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about the intersection of those two things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's at its most beautiful. That's what's always beautiful about my time in Israel-Palestine, is those things at their best seem completely intertwined. And so especially when I was with other people who were doing solidarity work in the evening or the weekends and we were learning Torah together, it was like it could feel almost all of a piece because the Torah was telling you to do that, and then you were coming back to the Torah and then you were doing that, and like there was this real sense of like wholeness. And then sometimes there was terrible disjuncture because I was learning with people, which I think was mostly a good, who were like politically completely diverse. So you also people who like they were not on that page and didn't have that political analysis of what was going on, and sometimes that was incredibly painful and even sometimes like very heavy, like, and also like the whole matzav, the whole situation, as Israelis would call it, is really heavy. So I felt heavy a lot of the time too, like, and I felt heavy in the Torah study, and sometimes the Torah study would make me feel better, and sometimes I think in a way that was good, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like it was looking right at those things in the face. But what I will say is like, and I guess it took me to being old enough to feel like I could say this with a straight face, is like I felt God present a lot. Like in the way that I feel is in your question, Naomi. Like if this is what you're wrestling with, which is the Torah's essential question, our spiritual ancestors' essential question, which is how do you live a wise life and a just life? And then you're looking at the world and asking that question all the time. And unfortunately, in that part of the world that is beloved by me so much, it's very stark. Those questions sometimes feel very stark, and they are everywhere. It reminds you that it's a microcosm of the macro, that we're all living in that all the time, like, but it feels very present there. If you're engaged in those things, then like it can feel like the divine is in everything, which is what gave me hope, because I also feel like there was so much to despair about, but I felt that something was witnessing. I feel that something does witness. I think that's where my theism comes in. The sense of hope is like, I believe that these things are witnessed. I can't prove that to you, and I don't mean it means that they're all going to be solved, but I believe that the tradition's message is that it's either that we witness them, so God witnesses them, or that somehow they are witnessed, but that some way being involved in the world in that way means that there is something that sits with those who suffer. And I felt that when I was there. Yeah, Justin.
Sorry if I missed it and you did answer, but I think you were going to say something about your definition of Zionism and non-Zionism and anti-Zionism.
Yeah, it's funny because I can map that onto that journey that I told you, Justin. So like I started very much as a liberal Zionist. Then I think I probably started identifying as a non-Zionist like during that time when I was doing all that solidarity stuff in the West Bank. And then something about my experience of October 7th and the way that I told you it made me feel that these leaders in the government were going to use it to destroy people made me like identify with anti-Zionist. And I say all of that because that's all true. And also I've kind of come back around again to being like, all of that is nonsense. Like it is both 100% true, like, and I tell you that as a narrative, and like I think it's helpful, and also like I had these long discussions with some of the very sweet, like right-wing 21-year-olds, and I think it is more 21-year-olds these days who are right-wing, is my experience, in the yeshiva, who were like, I was, in New York during this whole past time, and I ran into all these actual screwball anti-Semites, and so I think anti-Zionism means anti-Semite, and they meant it, and I was like, so anti-Zionist is not a useful label strategically in some settings. If what I mean by anti-Zionist is I am in solidarity with Palestinians, they're not going to hear it that way. They're not going to hear that I'm in solidarity with a group of human beings. They're going to hear that I hate them. And so like I struggle with these labels. They're really hard. And it's something that Holly and I as chair and rabbi have talked about a lot, is like, how do you get beyond them in a useful way where you're not talking about anything, right? And so that's why I've gone back to talking more about like, and like everyone, like power dynamics and everyone there deserving a right to live there and to flourish, and and these stories. But yeah, like I identify as an anti-Zionist because of the story I've told you all, but I hesitate in some contexts to use that, not because I'm not, I think you understand, like courageous, but because sometimes I actually think it hurts the cause. But I also am annoyed about that. So that's where I'm at. Yeah.
Question here. On the
Yeah.
lagging, okay. On the settler violence stuff, I'm not sure if I can be heard. Can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear.
Oh, yeah. On settler violence, a sentiment I see a lot online is that like it doesn't really help anyway. Like in the end of the day, like the village gets expelled later on. These things only delay it, and when you're actually there, you're just standing there filming. You can't. No one can actually be like you couldn't actually physically stop a soldier or a settler because of the power dynamic. And how do you like? It's not something a sentiment I agree with, but it's like how do you feel about that? Yeah.
So there's a couple things I'll say, and like obviously I really am one person, and now my experience, so like I have some knowledge, but this is just one comrade in arms to an. I did want to address this more like effectiveness of solidarity work and safeness. So on the effectiveness side, to your question, Avi, there's a lot of critiques. That's one of them. Another comes from like the sort of hard left that like we as Jews, I lived there and I, was there as a privileged citizen for many years. And I think that's a power dynamic that's really complicated, like to come from out of the place and not having needed to be there. Like it's absolutely one thing to grow up there or to have been there for many years, but to decide with this political analysis I have that I need to be there always felt complicated. And then is it effective enough for me to be, how much do you have to do to be effective? And I'll tell you, honestly, I felt like I wasn't doing enough. And one of the reasons I know that I couldn't stay there as someone who didn't grow up there and have grandparents there, and that's a whole other kettle of fish, I really feel like but like I am a Londoner and like I just chose to be there. I don't think I could be there long term because like I don't think it's effective enough for me to say it was my life unless it was my full-time job, and it wasn't. And if it's your full-time job, I do think that I have a lot of time for that, but also then you're incredibly traumatized and you have to leave it. I've seen everybody who's done that have to leave it. But effectiveness, I was just talking about this with mentors who know more than I, like Maya Rosen, who's one of the leaders of one of the organizations there, fluent Hebrew and Arabic speaker, writes for Jewish Currents in New York. And I asked her this exact question. I said, like, so what's your answer to that critique? And she goes, look, it's not effective in the sense that we haven't had enough wins and we're really out organized. And also, every time we document something and it slows it down, and every time we keep one family on the land because they invited us for another year or another month or another week, what we're trying to do is slow this. And we slow it until what we hope for is some massive shift, right? And so everything you can preserve and that you can be a part of slowing and keeping is a mitzvah in the kind of like colloquial sense of that word. And like I think she's right, but it's also incredibly heavy to think of it that way. And then as to like the other effective thing too is that now a lot of Palestinians have said, because it's been so bad the last 2 or 3 years, like how empowered the settler right feels and how hand in glove the IDF and the settler community was, which wasn't the case 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago to the same way. Like it's become more and more like because of leadership from on high and the way that things like societally have gone, it's become like a partnership. All of those things mean that like after we, the solidarity activists, are there, sometimes then communities get torched like threefold. And all I can tell you is that you have to just check in with the leadership on the ground who are there, who are inviting you, and ask them these questions. And if we are continuing to be invited by like communal leadership, then obviously they're deciding to take that risk, and that's their dignity to take that risk, right? To say like, we know we will become more targeted when you all leave. Safety wise, it is more unsafe than ever, and I totally get your friends in Ramallah saying like, don't do it. Like one of the reasons I felt I also had to leave is I had become a mother, and like I used to put my body on the line, as you heard, like pretty frequently, and like I had my eardrum like pierced by a sound bomb, and I have like a very minor PTSD. I always realize when I talk to my sister who's got it more from like those direct actions where like you're really in fear for your own life, and I don't think you should take it on lightly. and it's gotten scarier. Like when I went out to the olive harvest less than a year ago, I really felt, and checking in with other activists, they affirmed this for me, that it was like a 1 in 2 chance that we would encounter violence. That did not used to be the numbers. You used to go to the olive harvest and you were like bored, right? Because there were so many of you and we were so well organized, and it was 5-10 years ago under different governments that were not as empowering of this aspect of the world as they are now. And you'd be like, well, I'm really glad I got to harvest some olives and drink some tea. But now it's like a 1 in 2 chance that like something might happen. And I was very lucky and nothing happened. And then shortly after that, I got pregnant, and I was like, oh, maybe like I can't like do this all the time, you know? So there's those considerations. But that's what I would say. I would say I still very much believe it is effective. I think you go with the organizations you all are talking about. They really know what they're doing. And it is not safe, and it never was, but it's even less safe than it used to be, unfortunately. Yeah, Saul and Naomi.
Given that for Jewish history we haven't had a Jewish nation state, what's your view on the Jewish nation state given your Israel-Palestine?
I honestly don't know, Saul, because like I like feel it from all sides when I hear people who like are better, you know, political theorists and better like sociologists than me. Because like on one hand, like I don't like ethno-nationalism. It's obviously led us to some bad places here and in my country of origin and in Israel-Palestine. And so like down with ethno-nationalism. And what I mean by that is creating nation states around ethnic identity. That seems to be what got us in this trouble. Also, having said that, like most nation states are sort of ethno-nationalists in their essence. And like I think the dream to have a Jewish ethno-state did not have to end this, not have to end, quote, not have to be in 2026 in this way, right? I believe you could have a Jewish majority and not oppress everybody else, you know? And like, you know, it is like I hear like the liberal part of me rather than the leftist part of me speaking when I say this. And so I'm like a little embarrassed, but I actually think I don't have to be, which is to say like, you know, Jonathan Freeland, who I don't agree with on very much, and he annoys me sometimes, but he always says like, you know, the classic like Jewish line of like, why is it that I have to get rid of mine first? And it's true, like the Kurds are trying to create a Jewish ethno-state, so are the Palestinians. Sorry, not Jewish ethno-state, but you know what I mean. Like everyone seems to want an ethno-state. And like Palestine should probably also have one. And if it's that solution, then it's Israel and Palestine, and it won't be perfect. Or that's why I'm kind of into confederation, because I think it will challenge everybody to not be such an ethno-nationalist. But you know, like I'm very glad I'm not the person in the room to make those decisions, because it's definitely beyond my pay grade. I think that's where I'm at. Let's take 2 more minutes if there's any last thoughts. Yeah, Holly.
Hello, I'm actually not on the tube anymore. Thank you so much. This was really interesting. And obviously you and I talked all year anyway, so I knew some of this stuff. But I'm just, I hesitate to bring this up because I don't want to turn it into a political, but I sent you the article today about Hackney and the possible de-twinning with Haifa. And I guess what makes me sad about that, for those people who don't know, our new mayor of Hackney and the new council are going to be discussing de-twinning with Haifa. And I guess what makes me so sad about that is of all cities, Haifa is this real example of how Jews and Muslims and Christians live in a city together, and it doesn't happen in very many places in Israel. And I just wonder how we, you know, using your experience and how we at Kehillah can help people to be more open to the fact that they're not leaving, no one is leaving, and you can BDS everybody and you can kick everybody, you know, from here you can do all these things, but it will either end in violence, terrible violence, or it's going to end in everybody getting out together. So I just wonder what you think about, like, what can we do to help people be a little bit more open, maybe?
Well, this is, I would say, sort of my leading edge of question myself. Like, is your question, Holly, which is to say, like, the podcast I'm listening to right now about Israel-Palestine are things where 3 or 4 different experts who are certainly more expert than I discuss those questions of like what is actually strategic, because I think that's really what the question is. It's like if decoupling with Haifa by Hackney would end some of what we were discussing, then I would mostly be for it. And then the question is like, is that what it's for and doing? And like, so I don't have, that's why I wanted to talk to you today. Well, I'm looking forward to talking tomorrow about all this, is like, I think I don't know those answers. Like, I believe in boycott, sanctions, and divestment as a nonviolent strategy. And also, like, I'm always sort of fascinated but frustrated when I listen to like debates about, Sally Rooney's new book, and how she like, got it through the various channels so that it could be published by an Jewish Israeli publisher. And I'm half moved by that because some of the lingo is you've got to do that because then you create the organizations that you don't have that aren't complicit, so that when this is, please God, in a better place, you have those organizations. On the other hand, it's like, if that was how you had to do it, then no Jewish Israeli is ever going to read good literature again. And can that be helpful? It's all the usual questions of like, of boycott, and like, and we all like quote the ANC as if we know what they said in 1982, but actually I don't think any of us have ever read any of those books about that strategy. So like, I feel like these are my questions, is like, I don't know. And then of course, on top of that, you have latent anti-Semitism in the world. So then some people just want to boycott Jews. And it's like, what do we do with that? So yeah, I feel very multivocal on that issue, and I'm very open to like having you all like tell me what you've been reading and listening to. And I have like 2 or 3 podcasts to share with you, like that Sally Rooney piece and some others like that are like Brad Lander. He was just elected, as one of the Jewish Democratic Socialists in the Mamdani sort of like wave. And I overall find that wave incredibly powerful from my political perspective. And Brad Lander was just on Art saying like, he isn't for every little aspect of that, whereas the rest of his comrades are, because he has some of these like sort of critiques of like, does cultural boycott work and whatever. And like, so I'm like existing in that space where I'm interested in all of that. And I'd be interested what do Hackney Jews like you all feel about that, like about that whole discourse. Like, is it going to be helpful to decouple with Haifa? Not because most people in Haifa are nice people. That's not the question. The question is like, will it stop people being segregated and not having citizenship and being kicked out of their homes, or won't it? And like, then it should end the decoupling, right? When that's and over it, so I don't know. That's my answer. I want to hear what you think about it. I know you don't have time to respond, but yeah, let's take Bo, and then we'll close, and then we can talk about that more. That's what I want you all to like help me think through, is like, how do we strategically, how do we do collective action, each of us in this moment, that actually is useful? Yeah, Bo.
Sorry, I know it's like past time, so is it okay to just say something quickly?
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
we'll close.
Cool. Yeah, no, I was just mentioning maybe for people who are considering to go to the harvest, I'm actually going in October, with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. So, but yeah, I think I did 3 months in doing, solidarity presence, and it is that what I will say is that the thing that I think makes a huge difference to people who are there, yeah, that's the one, is, for instance, like I would be somewhere where settlers would attack us or something, like I got hit with metal poles and stuff like that, or they tried to run me over with a car sometimes. But at the same time, I can see that to me, they look like victims too, like they're just kids. Honestly, most of them are children, I think. And they talk about them being rehabilitated through this. And to me, it's painful. I'm just like, this is crazy. Like, this is like child labor. It's so strange. So they look almost like embarrassed that they're doing that. And if you speak to their humanity at the same time. Like, you just, most of the time I was just like, one of the only things that I learned in Hebrew was Ani lo mevin, which is like, I'm sure most of you know, like, it's like, I don't understand. And they'd just be like, what? Yeah, what do you mean? Like, and I just think when they see that you're not there to attack them either, it sort of slows down. And it is unsafe. It's very unsafe. But the difference to the people who are living there, like the families that I stayed with, the Palestinians, is that if you're there, like and you're filming and stuff like that, it does make a difference still. It's not as much as it used to. But then if they move on to the family across the road, they will beat them up, or even kill them or something if we're not there. So it really does. And I saw that happen. So I think it is valuable. And I think that it's worth doing, but it is very risky. I mean, I could tell you a lot more about it, but like, not now. But it is definitely, I think, worthwhile for the people there, and also just in solidarity. Like if people on my street were being attacked or something, I would go and stay with them. You know what I mean? So it's like it's that kind of thing to make them feel like they have people there to support them, no matter what their faith or religion is and stuff like that. It's kind of where I feel about it.
Thank you, Bo.
No worries. And thank you for everything that you said. It was really insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for bringing your hearts to this and and listening. And I genuinely would love to hear, like, now that I've shared so much, like, so personally from each of you, when I see you, just like tell me, what your insight is or what your thought is or what you could add to it, because I would genuinely like to hear a lot back having shared. Thank you so much.